Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting of the Policy and Government Relations Committee to order this evening for the School District of Waukesha Board of Education. This would normally be our opportunity for any citizens to speak. I don't know, do we have anyone signed up to? We do not. Okay. All right. Well, then we will begin the meeting with first verifying that the meeting is properly posted.
Yes, it has been.
All right. And our first action item then would be our approval of minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes this evening?
I so move.
Moved by Ms. Foyt,
Second.
second by Mr. Wad. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, 3-0. So then our first policy discussion information item would be the Neola update of July 23, volume 32, number 2.
All right,
Dr.
well,
Seibert.
thank you, Mr. Zenobia. Yes, we are into update 32.2 from Neola. Julie and I met with our Neola associate, Richard Zimman, on September 14th. 49 policies in that update, and to break them down, we'll have 17 that we'll take care of here in the Policy and Government Relations Committee over the next couple of months. We tried to split those kind of in half. 15 of them will go to the Human Resources Department, 3 to Teaching and Learning, 8 will go to Student Services, and 6 will go to Finance and Facilities. So I will work with those cabinet members who will then work with their committee chairs to process those updates. And we just wanted to give you that high-level overview. Julie and I like to do that each time we have one of those updates, just so you can see per our policy where those policies, I use the word policy a lot, get dispersed.
Sure.
Yeah.
Were there any additional comments or questions on that? Ms. Foyt?
I just want to say I appreciated seeing that. I've been on policy 3 years previously and never got the feel of when they come in and in bulk. We've always been told about the numbers, but I appreciate the seeing what they are and then the breakdown.
Oh, sure.
This is quite informative, and I can see the logic of breaking it down by the committees that would be most, finance and facilities pertains to this, HR pertains to that type of thing. I have a much better overall concept now.
Oh, good.
Thanks for sharing.
Oh, yes, yes. You can thank Julie for that. She does a wonderful job. She's great to work with.
All right, moving on to our action items, our first of which would be our association memberships, which is policy 0175.
All right, well, I will get us started on that, Mr. Zenobia. Thank you. We referenced the policy 0175 because that is where association memberships are mentioned in board policy. But if we remember back in June, we had a discussion at F&F around the memberships that the district was associated with. We talked about the 2 that we currently have, one with the Wisconsin Association of School Boards and the other with the Southeastern Wisconsin Schools Alliance. And as part of an annual process, we want to go through those committee memberships, association memberships, I should say, and each year discuss, should we maintain those, should we alter those, what's the choice of the board. So with that being said, we came out of that meeting in June with the thought that Dr. Piasek and I would meet with our Region 11 representative from the WASB to learn more about the WASB and how we might be able to better maximize our membership, if you will. So Dr. Piasek was gracious enough to join us this evening. We thought maybe we could. We did that in July. We thought maybe we could give you an overview of that meeting and then talk a little bit about these 2 memberships and what we might want to consider going forward. So with that, Dr. Piasek, would you like to kind of talk about our meeting with Brett Hyde?
Definitely.
Sure.
Thank you. I haven't been on this side of the table for a long time. Well, thank you guys for letting me come talk to you. So this, as Dr. Seibert mentioned, started at FNF, and there were some questions about what are we paying for, what are we getting from our different association memberships. As an action from that meeting, we met with Brett Hyde, who's the Regional 11 representative for WASB. Learned a lot, and I think we found some opportunities to probably utilize our WASB membership a little bit better. In addition to that, we looked back at the policies that kind of govern association memberships, because at this point, if I look at that policy, there's no specific guidance around how we decide what associations we're in and which ones we're not. Some of you may recall a couple years ago, the WASB made a decision not to participate in the NSBA. And then there was actually some policy language that we had that referenced NSBA, and there were some corrections that Neola recommended about that so that it was just cleaner. So when I went back and looked at this policy, it was like there's some specific mention of WASB, but it kind of says may. But there's really no guidance that says who makes the decision about what associations we're a part of. And if we're a part of that as a district or as a board, I think it's probably something that we as a board should decide what we want to participate in. The other thing that I just wanted, so let me talk a little bit about WASB, and then we can talk about SWSA too. When we met with Brett, we talked about the different ways that we utilize WASB. So there's a lot of resources that any board member can use. So there's policy guidance, there's individual communication guidance, there are resources within WASB that we can call on and get advice on things like election, campaign finance, things like that. I know that Sue utilizes the services around some of the campaign finance and election clerk related resources. That really does seem like we get what we pay for. It's a good resource. We have not been as actively involved in some of the Region 11 activities as we should be. We have a representative to the annual convention. We have several members that have attended the January convention, which I've attended, and I found it to be resourceful for a lot of various reasons. We've had ideas about presenting at that conference this coming year, which I'm excited about. But the takeaway message was there are services that we use, and then there are engagement opportunities that we probably don't. And I think some of that comes down to, do we know what's available to us? Are we able to make sense of the communications that we're getting? And we're all very busy and get a lot of emails, and sometimes those things come in or they send them to our home address, and it's just hard to kind of wrap our arms around a lot of it. And then are we actually having our voice heard as a WASB member in ways that we feel we're well represented? And one of the takeaways for me was, in some cases there may be conversations about resolutions or a majority position on a resolution, and perhaps we don't agree, and so we disengage, which we should do the opposite. But that does require more engagement by us as a board. So I look at that investment that we're making, that annual membership fee of, it's about, I have it in front of me here.
$14,639.
Thank you, Mrs. Voigt. A little under 15,000 plus the other events and things that we attend. And I do think we get quite a bit for that in terms of governance, in terms of some of the services that they provide, in terms of the networking and the education. The educational resources are very good. But again, we have to engage. And we provided some feedback as well, things like how to follow the calendar and how to understand what events make sense for us, and how to really be heard in some of the resolution conversations and proposals. But my takeaway from that was, we can do a better job as a board engaging in WASB, and we probably have to, because we're different. And we're not always going to agree with every other school district or board that's out there. But that's the place that we should be if we want to have conversations with districts that think like us and districts that don't. Really, I think that's where really important conversations are happening. And so once I started kind of paying a little bit more attention to the calendar and some of the different offerings that they have, I think there's a lot that can serve us well, especially including some of the Region 11 activities that probably make sense and represent districts that are in our neighborhood. But I do think that as a board, we have to do our best to try to utilize this resource, or we have to decide that it's not valuable for us. But I'm not at that point yet. I feel like there's enough services that we get as a district, and there's enough opportunity there for us to engage more and take advantage of more of those offerings, that we should continue. And in talking with Brett Hyde and some of the other WASB members, I think we can also make recommendations for events and trainings and other learning opportunities that we have. And so that's one where it's really gonna be on us to make the best of that resource. I guess I'll leave it at that with WASB, and then we can maybe come back to SWSA, which is a little bit different.
Any questions or comments? I don't know if, Dr. Siebert, if you wanted to add to that in any way, or did you want to?
No, I don't think so. I thought we had a very good discussion with Brett, and I think Dr. Piasek summarized it very well.
And I'll be attending the Region 11 meeting tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to that, and, it's just one of many. But I do think that this meeting could be one, the policy and government relations conversation could be one where we look at that calendar of opportunities and kind of share that out, and then we could bring that forward as part of our regular board meeting, just as information that passes through as discussion. Because I know we all get overwhelmed with a lot of the information that's coming at us, but there's a lot of good resources there.
Mrs. Voigt?
David and I had the opportunity to go to the conference, in July, was it June? Like right a few months back. And I thought there were a lot of really positive sessions that we were able to attend, and just a lot of really good resources that I came back very energized to pursue, learn more. And I really feel that the networking is a very, very big part of it. You're at lunch, sitting down and talking to people from all over the state of Wisconsin, and what do we have in common, and what kinds of things are, can be working, striving together to improve public education in the state.
Mr. Watt?
Yeah, I guess I'll just dovetail on that. I share a lot of those sentiments. I found it to be extremely educational as a new board member. A lot of topics that were covered in sessions that I went to really helped me understand better. I don't know how beneficial some of those sessions would be for a more veteran school board member. And I don't think those classes were particularly geared just towards new school board members. So I wonder a little bit about some of those training sessions, whether they become less useful as you become a more experienced board member. But I would also agree that the networking is an important component. We can become very focused just on what's happening in Waukesha, and not even understand that there are things that other districts are dealing with that, while we may not be dealing with them today, we may be dealing with them tomorrow, and that gives us an opportunity to develop some relationships with people. Should we have those things come up, that we can go to people and say, how did you resolve some of these issues? How did you deal with it? What are some of the challenges that we should be on the lookout for? So I would agree there are definitely benefits to some of those conferences. What's harder for me to understand, that I'd like to understand better, is how much time and money does WASB spend advocating for issues, particularly from a legislative and lobbying perspective, that are counter to the interests of our district and counter to the interests of our citizens. That's something I just don't have a good feel for, and I'd like to learn a lot more about that before I would ever feel comfortable making a decision about whether or not it's a useful investment of our taxpayers' money.
And let me just comment on that because I think that's an area where we, as an entire board, not just one person, but the whole board needs to be engaged in that. There's too much there for one person to be responsible for the legislative agenda for WASB, right? With respect to all the things, it's one of the things. And certainly if we're part of an organization that's lobbying for things that are 90% counter to our fundamental priorities, that wouldn't make sense. And then I think we have to weigh that against what are the other services that are provided and are we getting a good value out of those services? But this is where I would say if we make a concerted effort to learn more about what those initiatives are and to actually have our voice heard, I don't think we are alone in our perspective on things. I just think that we may not always see or hear those other districts because they may not be participating either.
Mr. Watt?
If I could, and I appreciate that, and I also appreciate the fact that, you know, in your comments earlier, you said that if there are resolutions or actions being taken by WASB that we may not agree with, the better choice for us is to get involved and try to explain why we feel that that isn't an appropriate position for WASB to take, for whatever reason it may be. And I have had conversations with citizens in our community that are concerned about WASB and our membership in it. And I've spoken to school members and other school board members in other districts who they're kind of the same mindset. Let's just get out. Why waste the money? I do think we have the opportunity, especially a district of our size, where we're located, some of the issues that we've already tackled here, to be able to bring perspective to WASB that could be valuable in helping frame some of the thoughts and directions that the body takes when it votes on resolutions, but we can't do that if we're not involved. So I do appreciate that perspective, and I do think there's value in trying to figure out what role we can play in helping to shape the debate statewide on some of these issues.
Mrs. Voigt?
I think one of the main lobbying things that I have been involved in was one that I picked up on. We went to Madison to do the Visit with Your Legislators Day the first time. You know, I went down there, and that's when I discovered the idea of the reimbursement for special ed funding. And that has been one of the main things that I've seen them lobbying for, you know, through my time of being a member. And like, it helped me to realize, you know, the mandate's there, but the money isn't, you know, and that's something that I really think we can sort of lobby together with everybody across the state for that type of initiative, you know, and there are other things like that, I'm sure, you know, that we can all be in agreement about, that would be something that would make our lives a lot easier if we were being reimbursed for the services that are mandated.
I think one of the things that came up in the last day with the legislators and some of that pre-budget conversation were like fundamental questions about what should the reimbursement rate be. So WASB is going to take a position, SWSA is going to take a position. We might have a different position about what that actual reimbursement rate should be. But those are conversations that I think we need to be a part of. And I think where we ended up maybe qualifying or clarifying some of our position as a district was helping our legislators during that visit. What does it mean for us? 30%, 40% reimbursement, and what does that look like in our bottom line? I think Dr. Siebert and his team did a really nice job of prepping all of that. So we didn't necessarily say hook, line, and sinker, we're all on board with what WASB and SWSA and others are saying, but we did say directionally, we all tend to agree that this unfunded mandate to a degree is something that's not sustainable. So I think then there's these questions of, you know, can we be a part of that association and take a different position? The answer is yes. But we have to be clear about that. I think we have to have those conversations, and that takes time. I think that's the biggest challenge for everybody, is that now this is more time that people need to be engaged in these conversations. And but I do think that at this point, we're getting a value in return to what we're putting in if we simply just look at the professional services and the support and educational resources. I think to Mr. Wad's point, you know, what is a long-term professional services and training and education going to mean for someone who's been a board member for 6, 10, 20 years? I may never know. But I see a lot of variety in what they're trying to provide. And I think Brett and others with WASB were very responsive to some of our questions, so.
Just one comment that listening to the conversation here. So now in January, when they put forward I think last time it was maybe 10 resolutions, and as a WASB rep, we went and voted on those things. And so the rep had the authority to do that, obviously. Now, all of the board got a packet, everybody had seen it, anybody could have put input into that at the time. In a situation like this, where we are a member of WASB, for instance, and we may differ in opinion, it would, I would assume, procedurally fall upon not only the WASB rep in some cases, but really the board president to say, this is where we differ, and although we don't really have a policy to govern that, I don't know that WASB does either. We're paying money, so kind of by default, we're saying, we're on board, but at times we find ourselves not to be. So from just a perspective of how we move forward on this, if at times it comes up that we do want to have our different opinion heard, it would have to go through the board president. And if we're going to do that, do we need something like that reflected in our policies? Yes, Dr. Piasek.
I do think that would be a benefit of taking a look at policy 175 and considering what authority different people on the board may have in this context. I think with this committee in particular, policy and the government relations piece, I think a lot of those conversations can start here, some of the legislative updates and reviews, and I think that would be a best practice for us as a board to have that flowing through our policy and government relations committee conversations, and then then it would come to the full board for discussion. And I think over the past few years, that's probably what we missed by having the representative who's there, trying to exercise the position of the board. I mean, the resolutions, WASB resolutions don't all pass unanimously. So, but that is the position that the association's going to take if a majority of members are wanting that to happen. And that, again, is something that I really think, so every board member of a board that's a member of WASB would have gotten the resolutions book in the mail. I spent a lot of time looking at that and trying to understand that. And but once those resolutions are passed, it's kind of too late for us to say, oh, hey, we wanted to have an opinion about that.
Right.
So.
Okay. Mr. Watt.
Yeah, so along those lines, in past years, have we sent our delegate with an official position that the board has taken on the resolutions within the packet? Is that something that happens in our, either at a board meeting or in a policy governance meeting?
So in my conversations with Mr. Como for prior years, he really gave that permission authority to that representative to act on behalf of the board based on the views and opinions of the board. I think over the last few years where the board maybe was in more of a split scenario on a couple of different topics, that got a little more challenging. And we've had various representatives. I think we had one miss the conference for health reasons within the last couple of years. But I know Mr. Zenobia went and acted on behalf of the board at one point. I think that was our first year, right, 2020?
Yeah, that would have been 21.
And so that latitude has kind of been given to that delegate to take votes in the interest of the board. And of course, that's something we could talk about too. And I think that's maybe what Anthony was getting at, was there may need to be more deep conversation about what we want.
Well, that's part of it. I mean, that's kind of the example of how we've operated with WASB in the past. However, moving forward in the future, we may just have differences of opinion on things coming up in the legislative process where WASB takes a position, for instance, and we would differ. Is there even a value in making a point about it at the time or not? I think is a discussion the board could have as these larger issues come up. And I guess it really depends on how active of a role do we want to have going forward. And that was kind of part of that thought process as well. So, Mrs. Voigt.
I think there's a lot of value in bringing up the counterpoints and points and counterpoints type of thing, and being able to come up with compromises that might actually get the approval of the legislature and the governor, because right now there's not a lot of, agreement in that type of process. If you come up with some things that would actually have everybody on the same page, would be amazing. And I think the more, everybody talking about what can we all agree on, I think would be a very positive thing that we could maybe model for, our other representatives to do the same.
Sure. So do we want to then go on to the SWSA brief that you wanted to share some thoughts on that as well, Dr. Siebert, Dr. Piasek?
So, the SWSA, Mrs. Voigt and I have been attending those meetings. They're virtual. There's a couple in person per year. And that would be a group that consists of, I want to say it's 30-ish, 32, something like that, Mrs. Voigt, districts in southeast Wisconsin. I think part of the things we want to think about is overlap in terms of, are we getting lobbying advice, for example, from both groups? Are we getting, different types of services that overlap from both groups? But, with that all being said, I certainly would open it up to Mrs. Voigt and certainly to Dr. Piasek too, to have any comments on the SWSA and perspectives.
Let me just start. I think in having the conversation with WASB about our opportunities with Region 11 that we've probably not been taking advantage of, the one question that comes up for me is, what's the difference, right? What are we ultimately missing if we do one versus the other? And there are a number of districts that are part of SWSA. Obviously, everybody's part of WASB. But there are some of our neighbors that aren't, and there are several that are. Up until this year, at least as I've been the president of the board, we didn't have a tremendous interest in someone being the SWSA representative. So Mrs. Voigt specifically asked about that, and I was grateful for her doing that because we weren't represented. Dr. Siebert represented us last year, and I attended, I think, one or two of their meetings. But they went through some leadership transition also. They provided their legislative priorities to us, or their annual report to us that was shared with all of you maybe a month or so ago. I think their website is a little bit behind where they're at in terms of their current priorities, so it's difficult sometimes to understand what is the topic, and I think they communicate well with the representative and with the superintendent. But that's another example where you kind of get what you put into it. And so we either need to consider other ways that we can take advantage of the information and the services that are provided there, or in terms of what they're giving, or do we have another avenue to actually find those from? And from a lobbying perspective, and to be fair, we've not had the formal conversation like we did with WASB, but it's not clear that the initiatives differ too much, or that the resolutions of WASB are significantly different from what's coming out of SWSA. So I do think we just need to think about time, effort, and money and what we're putting into the different associations in terms of, are we getting something of value? Are we giving enough to the organizations that we're being a good member, And I think in this case, this year, Mrs. Voigt has done a really nice job for us. But that's just another one that, like I said, we're in a position where we need to pay dues for these associations. And I don't know that we have, in the past, really had some consideration about what organizations we should be a member of.
Mrs. Voigt.
At our meeting tomorrow morning, we're going to be talking about what the legislative initiatives are going to be. You know, like, it's really determined by the 30 members. And it looks like the agenda is we're going to break into, like breakout sessions and talk about what should be the lobbying initiatives. And that's where you've got the representatives that are there, deciding it. It's not a predetermined. There are certain things that they, have had as their priorities last year, and we'll start with that. And then are these the same things that we still want to be, working towards? What I like about the SWSA component is we have gotten so many legislative feedback statements from the leader there. Literally, when things were happening with the budget, it'd be decided and we'd have something in our mailbox, reporting on it within a matter of hours, through the whole budget process. I really think that the current leader there has done an amazing job of trying to keep us aware of what is on the table. It's not an automatic that, like the grow your own concept that I brought up last time, that has been an issue there. What can we do to try to help to get people to, get our special ed aides to possibly become a special educator, like grow your own and get the certification in-house kind of programs. I think we talk about the common problems and how can we work to deal with them. And I think that's, we have representation from urban, suburban, rural, the cross-section. We're really like a microcosm of the whole state, but within our 30. And that I think we can have some influence in terms of the fact that if we do all agree that this is something that's important, that's like 30 districts saying that this is something worth looking at. It's a part. And we do have paid lobbyists that are working to try to advocate for whatever the group decides is a value.
Mr. Watt.
I guess what's not clear to me is, and I think this is also what you were getting at, Dr. Piasek, is how much of what you just described is just redundant to what WASB already does for us. And perhaps there's no redundancy. Perhaps there are very clear divisions or things that SWSA takes care of that we can't get through WASB. But that's, at least at this point, that is one of my biggest concerns, is that we belong to two different organizations that, to my limited understanding, I don't know a lot about either organization yet, I'm learning, sound like they do a lot of the same things. And maybe I'm missing something, and if that's the case, then I'd love to understand where they cover something that's beneficial to the district that we can't get through our membership in WASB.
I think one of the good things about SWSA is that the monthly meetings typically have guests there who are able to speak to the legislation related to the literacy bill, and pros and cons of it, and who might we be able to recommend as being candidates on the council that we'll talk about later on tonight, the 9-member council that's there. It's helped me to have a much greater understanding about what that legislation was all about. And as it was going through the process, like there were some things that were like really a hard no for a lot of people, related to like the retention of the third graders, and how they were going to handle that if they didn't pass the test. And just a lot of discussion that, I think I found it very, very valuable. I'm not sure you can speak to this as well, Dr. Siebert, but, just insights into the things that are happening. And over the years, we've had so many great guest speakers that have come in, legislators, like a panel of legislators, and have them talk about what their goals were for the year. Representative Voss, and others, and it's like sort of picking their brains about what are they thinking about in terms of how they have to balance the budget within, getting insights into, getting into their head and understanding why they make decisions that they do. So I think that's been a value for me. how we can, how I can share and Jim can share here, I think would be a part of that. That you can feel that you're, being able to benefit from those discussions as much.
So I think one of the challenges with a group like SWSA is, and there's administrators and board members who are member of that, which is nice. We still have a representative, so I think it's how do we consume all of the information that's coming back to us? And are those things that the board needs to consume, or are those things that administration can benefit from? And are we at a loss for having access to those resources anyplace else? I think that's what Mr. Wad was also asking. Like, are we participating because we're listening? Are we contributing? I don't know what the conversation was about the third grade, advancement standard. But I'd be curious why it was a hard no. And where's the balance of that conversation? But I don't know anything about it. So that's one where, again, we went through a couple years where we weren't really deeply engaged. I appreciate that Mrs. Voigt is now engaged. And again, to be fair, we haven't gone to the depth of trying to recover some of the service utilization that we have with WASB. But it's not clear to me that they are uniquely different. And when we're looking at paying those fees, I just want to make sure that we're doing that eyes wide open. But with that, we don't have anything in policy or board bylaws that kind of speaks to how we make those decisions. So my recommendation would be that we continue with WASB because there's a service provided to every one of us as board members. There's services that the district can take advantage of. But I do think that we either need to reconsider or consider differently how we engage with SWSA and any other future, smaller sub-organizations that we might engage with, just to make sure that we're spending the money appropriately. And I just want to be clear too, it's not in any way a criticism or comment on the role that Dr. Siebert and Mrs. Voigt are playing, because I know they're spending the time and learning a lot. It's just not been clear for the last few years that we're getting our money's worth out of that. So I think I'm kind of looking to you all, even in the absence of a couple committee members, to consider what we could do differently maybe with this policy. And what you would like me to do from a recommendations perspective as far as these memberships, because we're at that point where we have to make those decisions.
Dr. Siebert, do you, in reading the policy, only WASB is mentioned. And does this policy just go so far back that that was just included, or did the board at one time either include that language, or did they vote on it?
I think this dates back to 2015. I think WASB is mentioned in the Neola template, and I think also, to Dr. Piasek's earlier point, the National School Boards Association was also mentioned, and I think was mentioned somewhere that we had to adjust that. Whether or not it needs to mention any organizations would be something the committee could consider, certainly, and we could, and/or how those decisions are made in terms of what associations the district belongs to from a board perspective could be referenced in that policy if you so choose. And I think the other thing that potentially we could do, Dr. Piasek and I had a very good meeting with Brett Hyde. We potentially could try to replicate that meeting with Faith from the SWSA to talk more deeply about that relationship too, prior to coming back to be able to update this policy in a couple of months if that was in your interest.
Mrs. Voigt?
I'm wondering, another component of this is that you're part of an association of superintendents group as well. You know, and that, again, would be a auxiliary piece to this because of the lobbying information that you get and the representation that you'd actually done in Washington DC even.
Sure.
For that group. That I think, you know, because of having a superintendent that's been very actively involved in that level, you know, for this association of superintendents, you know, if you weren't in that involved there, I think SWSA might seem more pertinent because you have a very strong involvement through the superintendent's group, you know, that he's bringing to the table and the awareness of legislative initiatives and things like that on the state level.
Well, thank you for that. Yes. Yeah, there's no question. I mean, I think to the question of overlap, there's a lot of overlap, whether it's through the superintendent's organization, whether it's through Darren's WASBO group, which is the business officials, the WASB, the SWSA. I mean, we get legislative updates through our CISA meetings. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to get this information. There's no question about it. So I think it comes down to what could we do within this policy that would maybe more clearly articulate what memberships the board wants to be part of and how are those decisions made? And then maybe it's just a little bit more work on our part to say, is this something we want to continue? What are we missing? What aren't we taking advantage of? And come back and talk about that. That's just in listening to the conversation, but certainly what your thoughts, Dr. Piasek.
Maybe in response to Mrs. Voigt's comment about some of the other professional associations, I did consider that when looking at the board bylaw 0175, which I think is specific to the institutional memberships versus the professional memberships. So I just want to be careful that we don't limit what some of our professional administrators have access to that might actually, from a career and professional insights and continuing education perspective, be beneficial to them as individuals versus what we're participating in as an institution and as a board. So I was trying to separate the two that we belong to really as a board on behalf of the district versus the ones that they belong to as individual administrators, which I think are a little bit different. Now, obviously, there's similar kinds of activities, but I think it's just a little different from a intent.
And then the shared convention in Milwaukee in January, you know, with all those groups along with WASB.
Right.
Mr. Watt?
Yeah, thank you. So I definitely think that it would behoove us as a board when there are formal votes that are up for consideration in these various organizations that we are members of, that the board or a committee of the board, at the very least, have an opportunity to provide guidance to our delegate as to the position that we expect them to advocate for on behalf of our district. It's always been a concern of mine how we make those decisions about how do we know that our representative is representing what the collective school board would want on any particular issue. And perhaps there is a vehicle for that exists, and I just haven't seen it carried out yet. But if that doesn't exist, I would definitely be supportive of something, in whether that comes through the Policy and Governance Committee initially and then eventually gets forwarded onto the board for their endorsement as well, that we should be sending our representatives with guidance when there are issues before those bodies where our vote will be cast. Which isn't to say that I don't think we're getting representation like that today. The point is, I don't know. And even if we are today, that doesn't mean that tomorrow or next year or 3 years from now, we might not have a representative who puts forward their personal views as opposed to that of the majority of the board. So that would be one component of a policy that I'd like to see.
Mrs. Voigt?
Related to that, like, the only thing I voted on so far at SWSA was this idea of the grow your own kind of initiative, and should they start a legislative movement to make, basically a bill and eventually a law to make that certification available. We talked about it here, that was the only thing I voted on so far. And I think to have, like, maybe on our agenda, an SWSA report, per se, that anything that is going on at those meetings, that we could definitely bounce it off, and that's what I'm hoping to do, bounce it off through this committee to be able to represent your interests when I go back, to those meetings. And obviously, Dr. Siebert as well. We had two votes on anything, so.
If I could just comment briefly on that as well. So, and obviously I haven't been leading the board all that long, but I had some good conversations with Mr. Como as well. Two things have to happen, right? Somebody has to want to do it, and then we have to entrust them with representing the board, to the best of their ability. So that's been a challenge. The president nominates someone to be the WASB delegate and to be the SWSA representative. Like I mentioned, we had a couple of years where there wasn't anybody who wanted to do the SWSA piece. WASB is a little bit different, but then we're sometimes limited by, can they actually make the meeting? Can they participate? So that probably is something we might want to take a look at, just making sure that we do have representation and that person is really well authorized by the board to go and make some of those decisions. I think we could look at that over the course of the year and just make sure that schedule works and that we have a backup if somebody does get sick, which has happened. And that we're talking about those things well in advance. And we do have time to review them. It's just sometimes the communication goes to that representative, and like I said, a lot of things do get lost in email. So we have to make a really concerted effort to be aware of what they're doing and have our voice be heard. It's going to take some effort.
So we have talked about renewal for these in the past. I know a couple times this has come up. Do these renew yearly, Dr. Siebert?
Yes.
Okay. And so every year we do vote, correct, to renew?
I don't believe we have voted. No, we've just kind of been in a process of renewing them annually. This year, we started talking about should we do that on an annual basis, and so we haven't paid either of these to date.
Okay. I know just from my own memory that I was vocal the last time that SWSA came up, and I felt that for a lot of the reasons stated here, that it was not necessarily in our best interest to continue with them. Because there is overlap, but also because, and the same could be said of WSAB, that there's not a lot of transparency in the process because there's a lot going on that not everybody can follow. And for any board or any member of any board to bring all that to light in a timely manner that's helpful to the board, I think that's very hard to do. And then, how much value does that provide, given that it's talking about some legislation that won't even ever see the light of day? So there certainly are advantages to both. But, my point in bringing that up is within the policy itself, there really is no clear authority giving either way, other than, to the board or to the superintendent. So as it stands now, the way that I see the policy, we could decide at any time to opt in or out of any membership, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the other question that I have is, I think we mentioned this. We have two groups that we would define as being part of this policy: WASB and SWSA, and not of any of the other professional memberships that were mentioned. Correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Since this is an action item, I don't know of any other authority that could be put into the policy that's not already there, given to the board to make decisions on where we should and should not participate, correct? So I don't know if there's anything that we can clarify. I think that's possibly discussion for the future. However, in the first paragraph, or in the first sentence rather, I would motion to amend that we change, it reads, "The Board of Education may maintain membership in the Wisconsin Association of School Boards and may take part in the activities of these groups." I would say may maintain memberships, strike, in the Wisconsin Association of School Boards and may take part in the activities of, and I would insert such groups instead of these. Because if we are to, as opposed to naming one of the two that we're in, like we had the NSBA in this policy in the past, we don't have SWSA. I think just gives us a little bit more flexibility and clarity of what we're doing to include memberships or not to include memberships. I don't know how the committee would look at that recommendation, but.
I don't know that we're needing to reword the policy at this point. I think it's more a matter of an action item on if we want to renew in these memberships at this point. And then long-term, look at some changes that might be included here, to speak to how we can have more, like transparency to the discussions that we're having in terms of reporting out on, like, in what kind of ways you want to see those reports, et cetera.
Okay.
That was my intent of at least just bringing this back to you all tonight following the action from the F&F committee, with the couple of time-sensitive things, which is we have dues to pay. And then we have a policy that really doesn't give us guidance, and it's maybe a little bit too specific on some things, and it's not specific enough on other things. So in the absence of any specific procedure, I guess, you could take an action that could flow up to the full board, or you could bring it as a discussion to the full board. My strong recommendation would be that we find a path to either agreement or not on paying the WASB dues, because I think we've been utilizing those services, and I can't come up with a good reason to not continue at this time, but I do think this next year and the level to which we can really engage and make the best of those resources is going to be very important. So I feel a little bit more confident maybe trying to recommend that we do something that allows us to pay. Otherwise, I could just recommend, or Dr. Sieber could continue to take the path that we had taken in the past, but I want to make sure everybody's on board with that.
Mrs. Voigt.
I guess I'll make a motion to approve the memberships in WASB and SWSA for this year, as a motion that we can, take action on if I get a second.
Do I have a second? Seeing none.
So the motion dies for lack of a second.
So correct. I guess from my perspective of reading the policy of where I'm at, I would want the board to discuss, obviously, whether or not we're going to move forward with either one of these. And so in doing that, I think that's where the discussion would need to lie, was with the full board, correct? Would be my opinion, and why I wouldn't necessarily move that forward. So I would make the recommendation to approve WASB and not WSA for the coming year. That would be the motion that I would make.
Second.
All right. All those in favor of the motion to, I'm sorry. First, we would have discussion on that. Any other comments to that?
Well, I think, as was suggested, it'd be nice to have Faith have a chance to come in and talk about what SWSA is all about. And at this point, before we decide that we're not going to do SWSA, I'm not that well-versed in all the things that they do and et cetera, that, as you had given the chance to hear what WASB does have to offer, I think Faith, I would like to have her have the opportunity before we completely say that we want to be out of SWSA.
Okay. Mr. Watt?
Yeah, if I could, Dr. Siebert or Dr. Piasek, can we opt in or opt out of these organizations at any time? So, for example, if we were to decide that we are not in favor of renewing SWSA at this time, could we say 3 months from now, 6 months from now, re-enroll? Or is it an annual, enrollment period that we would have to wait for?
The billing is on an annual basis, July 1, just like our fiscal year. So we're already into that cycle. I don't know that I know it works on an annual basis. If a district wanted to join at a later point, I'm sure that a conversation could be entertained.
Mr. Watt?
Yeah, so while I'm not opposed to learning more about what SWSA has to offer, it seems pretty clear to me that a lot of what they do is duplicative of what WASB does. I think there's a general consensus that just by its sheer size, number of staff, the different professional services they offer, that we know that there is a value that we're getting from WASB that's commensurate with our annual dues, which is why I'm okay with approving that as we continue to learn more from the staff there and we determine how we can more effectively engage. What's not clear to me is whether there is any additional value that SWSA brings, and therefore I would be inclined to say we should take a step back from there. We can allow SWSA to come and talk to us. They can share with us maybe things that we don't understand about what they could do for us that we can't get from WASB or through our administrators' involvement in other professional organizations that they may be a part of. And if, after having those conversations, we determine that there is value there, we certainly can re-enroll at any time. But to me, just based on the little bit that I've heard here tonight and from talking to other people who have some familiarity with SWSA, there just isn't enough value add from my perspective to justify it at this point. And I guess I would want to put the onus on SWSA to convince us otherwise, since I don't know that there's anyone in this room that has been able to provide a clear idea of what the added value is that we get from SWSA that we don't get from WASB today.
Okay. Well, with our motion on the table, we had passed to move on with WASB and to terminate for now SWSA. So in taking action on that as amended, all those in favor, say aye.
A point of clarification.
Go ahead.
Point of clarification. Before I vote on this, I just want to make sure. Will this be then in the consent agenda on Wednesday, or
Action item,
would it, or
action item.
will we?
It's not a policy revision, so it would go to a full discussion and
Okay,
possible action. yeah.
very good. All right, I'm good. I'm ready to vote.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed?
Nay.
So measure passes 2-1. Okay, let's move on to our second action item, which is the electoral process, policy 0142.1. Dr. Siebert?
All right, thank you, Mr. Zenobia. So, this policy has been updated to clarify, I should say, requirements for people filing declarations of candidacy, as well as requirements for incumbents seeking reelection. And order changed just a little bit in order to outline that. I do know Mrs. Voigt has some suggestions that she would like to recommend on this policy, so.
Should I share those at this point?
Sure. I will let her take it from there, and then we can certainly answer any questions that the board has, or the committee, I should say.
My
Thank you.
recommendation is actually to just reorder the paragraphs that are in the Neola document, and then further clarify the explanation about what is required to be a candidate, running for school board. You can see I've numbered the paragraphs along the left-hand side, and the first thing I would do is reorder them to say, paragraph 1 is an introduction, then declaration of candidacy. The logical paragraphs under that would be 2, 8, and 6. If you want to take a look at that context. And then as you're reading paragraph 2, what I would like to recommend that we add is not just a declaration of candidacy, but as all of you know, as candidates, you also have to have a campaign registration statement before raising or spending any funds, and circulate nomination papers for a nonpartisan office requiring 100 to 200 signatures. Because I think anybody just reading this would like, well, that's all I need is to go in a declaration of candidacy, and there's so much more than that on December 1 that they'd find out about that are part of the, the package of expectations for the process.
One point of clarification, are either of those points reviewed or explained in any of the statutes that are here?
We may have
Do
to
you
add some
know?
more statutes to the bottom, because they are, on the documents that you pick up, when you go in to fill out the form, it's the campaign, submitting a campaign registration statement, it is Form CF1, and then it does, in the document that we receive at that time, there are Wisconsin statutes that go along with it, and the administrative codes, et cetera, that those could very easily be added as a legal reference at the bottom.
Okay. The major reference is 120.06, which,
Is that's on here?
that's on there. It doesn't mention the parts that Mrs. Voigt included, number 2 and 3.
Sure.
So to add what she's suggesting would be a good idea. And I think her suggestion is just to provide some additional clarity to people that are looking at the potential of running. We did share this with Sue, who is our elections expert in the district, and she found it to be fine and
Sure.
accurate.
Sure.
I mean, I think one of the things that Dr. Piazzik has asked us to do is to try to have our policies be reflecting what's actually happening. And this would be making our policy reflective of the 3 documents that you need to be involved in being, to be able to run as a candidate.
Sure. Go ahead, Mr. Watts.
Just a quick question on this. So, obviously, all of us that are at the table as board members knew that we needed to turn in, a campaign registration statement. We needed 200 signatures. Where is that? I'm trying to recall, where is that currently identified, if not in board policy? Where is that? It has to be on our site somewhere, right?
Well, I was going to say, it's all state policy, it's state expectations, and like, it's just that our electoral policy that goes back to, 2021 doesn't detail.
But not every district requires signatures, so that must be something unique to us. Right?
First-class cities require 400 to 800, with no territory within a first-class city. Yeah, there's, based on your size, there is 20 to 100 or up to 400 to 800 signatures
Okay.
required. So it's, again, it's statute. that's, state law that's making those determinations.
Okay.
And I think to that point, and it may be on that document that you have there, that's a state form that if you go searching, how do I become a candidate? That'll take you there.
Right.
And so, does it say on there what it's like wisconsin.gov something, is it not? Do you,
This, the
Something
document that she gave us doesn't necessarily have a website per se, but it talks about the Wisconsin Elections Commission out of Madison as a source
Okay.
to find out the specifics.
Yeah. Just to Mr. Wad's point of when you decide that you want to become a candidate, you do find your way to that exact document that you have there. So, and then it outlines for you what is needed here in Waukesha, if you will. To that point, it's not going to be the same everywhere, and
And that's why Neola wouldn't be giving, like a
Right.
specific that you need between 100 and 200 signatures, because that's unique to us. And there are some other things in here that, like at the end of paragraph 6, I've scratched the part about a person seeking office forms of representative area. That's not, we don't have it. If you live in this part of the city of Waukesha, then you represent seat number 1. If you live in this part of the city, then you represent, seat number 2. If you live in the village, you represent seat number 3. We don't do it that way. So that's why the order of the names on the ballot would be determined by lot, period, Actually, there would be period right there, and forget the rest of that part that's Neola's version of how to deal with, other situations.
okay. And Dr. Siebert, you had mentioned something about our in-house expert had looked at this as well and found that was, okay.
So,
Go ahead, Mr. Watt.
yeah, so just a couple of things here real quick. I mean, I certainly think anything that we choose to put in policy that reflects state law and the way that we actually conduct our elections, I think makes sense. So, I support the changes that Mrs. Voigt is proposing here. In principle, there's just a couple of things that kind of jump out at me, and one that I have a question on. So there are a couple of places in here, and I'm trying to find them now on Mrs. Voigt's sheet, where it refers to having to file forms provided by the district. Let me just make sure.
That's paragraph 2.
Paragraph 2, and I think it says something relative to other forms later on, but I don't think it's required that we get them from the district.
No,
We can simply download them from the WEC website, the same place where Mrs. Voigt got the instructions, and download them there. So I don't think we need to include that language any place it exists. I think we might want to call out that they are available from the district, but can also be downloaded from the Wisconsin Election Commission website as well. So that might be something we want to look at, just to make sure that we're providing the two different options that potential candidates have for gathering and submitting their paperwork. The other question that I'm curious about goes back to the original changes that we had before we started considering, the additional language that Mrs. Voigt is proposing. It appears as though there was some concern about the wording of declaration of candidacies and declarations of non-candidacies. Is there an issue that we're trying to clarify or rectify around specifically incumbents and when and what they're required to do relative to the filing of their intentions not to run because there's language that talks about an extension that's granted if they haven't filed their non-declaration and so forth. So I'm just curious the context behind those recommended changes.
Sure. My notes from our meeting say they were simply trying to clean up the order of the policy for clarity and kind of separate those two parts
Okay.
a little differently. I don't know that there was anything beyond that.
Okay.
And then it all runs together. Like they're talking about the incumbent board members deciding that they, a non-candidacy type of situation, is like paragraph 3, and it really should be under the next subheading, It just the train of thought, the logic of the order wasn't speaking to me. Because really, the declaration of non-candidacy fits under, paragraphs 3 and 4 fit under that heading. Because it's saying incumbent members, members may file a declaration of non-candidacy, so then they're not a declaration of candidacy anymore. It doesn't fit in that category. It fits in the second category.
So, Mrs. White, just so I'm clear, you're recommending the order be 1, 2, 8, 6 under declaration of candidacy, and then 3, 4, 7, 9 under declaration of non-candidacy, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And then moving up the idea of like whose name's going to be on the ballot to underneath, if you declare you want to be on the ballot, how they're going to figure out, the random draw for that, et cetera. One other thing I'm thinking to add, under the third document, is to identify that circulation of nomination papers, trying to get the nominations can't happen until after December 1st. Because that's another thing that a lot of people don't realize, I'm going to run for office, I can start filling out the forms.
Yeah.
You can't until December 1st. And I think, having some of those state expectations, kind of just an awareness of them if they look at our policy.
I'm wondering if we want to specify a date, or we want to say per state, cannot be circulated before the date specified in statute, because that could change, right?
Right.
So I'm just wondering if perhaps, rather than forcing us to have to change our own policy, if they change a date from, say, December 1st to, I don't know, November 15th or whatever, we're not having to scramble back to change our policy as well. But, other than that, I think that is probably a good thing to do, is to let people know there is a date that they cannot start circulating.
Start December 1, yeah. And maybe that is just the process begins after December 1st? Something to that effect,
If I could, just jump in for a second. Sure. I like the changes. I think it gives more clarity. One point I would make is not all people that will decide to run for a school board election will find their way to to our policies, correct? And then have all the information that they need, and, they're more likely to do a Google search and find their way to the state websites that provide that. And so, without getting too much into trying to put into policy everything that either the statutes have, or some of the websites that help you get to the information that you need to become a candidate, I just would maybe caution us not to be too specific for a couple of reasons. Things can change, and also how much information are we really providing that's helpful when this is, more or less the guidance of how things are done. I do like the changes. I think the one point that was made by Mr. Wad, saying solely by the district, or we could add or state of Wisconsin, for instance, to as a place of where you're going to find this information. Because as we're talking here, I just was trying to find the website that has the documents that Mrs. Voigt brought with her, and there's a couple different ways to get there. So, with that being said. I kind of like what we have. I don't know if there's too much more that we need to add to it. But if you think so, then please. If you think so, then please, I guess we would, make a motion to amend a couple of things, which I think we've already started with Mr. Watt's comments. So,
But one of the things I'd mentioned this afternoon is, like, we don't meet again until December, after this would be in process.
Sure.
After the December 1
Yep.
kind of procedures would be rolling along. So I'd like to be able to make a recommendation to the board on Wednesday to approve whatever you feel is appropriate, that it's actually out there and published and in our, board docs, that, any potential candidates would be able to see what's there. We could, spend a lot of time hashing it over, but then it would be after this batch, this series of times would actually go into effect.
sure. So on the point of the date of December 1st,
If that should be included. That's just a question I'm asking. And I just thought of that because it is a factor that, and again, a person that doesn't know anything about it, well, I have to get nomination papers. I'm having a party at Thanksgiving. Can I start getting signatures? It's like, no.
okay. Mr. Watt?
Yeah, so I'm wondering if, since this is almost, I think, a restatement of the guidance or the statutes provided, the laws provided by WEC on their website, if we wouldn't perhaps be better off to simply craft a policy that says the electoral process for school, the Board of Education is governed by, state law and, I'm sorry, I'm talking kind of off the top of my head. I haven't really thought about how I craft it, but basically say, to become a candidate, you need to follow this information and provide them where they can find it. And then I would think maybe what we could provide that would help clarify it for somebody that was looking for that information on our website is to tell them how many signatures they need to get. And anything that might be specific to Waukesha that wouldn't be specified in the state law because it provides different options for different size school districts, et cetera. Would that make it simpler for us to get something in front of the board on Wednesday? If we, instead of restating everything that you can find on that website, instead just point them to that page and say, these are the requirements for candidacy. Do they, I don't recall, do they have a section also on non-candidacy as well that matches what's in?
I think that's a unique Neola kind of explanation here about if you're not going to run again, like what the procedures would be. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's out there or not. But I'm looking at paragraph 2. Any qualified elector desiring election to the board, it's jumping right into filing the paperwork on, the first Tuesday in January. But I think, we might be informative to say that you need to get to the board clerk to discover the paperwork that's necessary.
And I think that might be where the information is probably easiest for someone to find is in the clerk.
To go to her on December 1st,
But also the website, I believe, directs you there. As we're messing around here trying to get to the page that you have in your hands. Because I think if we were to state that as well as forms provided by the district, potentially even add, I think to your suggestion, maybe the website,
guidance from the Wisconsin Election Commission.
I'm sorry.
Guidance from the Wisconsin Election Commission.
Right,
Yeah.
or at least where they can come to your forms And I think all that information is provided there then, that, everything that they'll have questions on is there. And I think to your point, Mr. Wad, that is a lot of information that could be put in here, and how valuable really is that to do that in our policies as a school board?
Well, and I, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking there are a lot of other things that candidates are required to do that we don't even touch in our policy around campaign finance laws, filing deadlines for that. I'm kind of thinking the less we get involved in our policy around stuff that's dictated by state law and leave that with, we can point them to where they need to go, but, I mean, all of us managed to find our way to these seats, right? And I think if we can just help them get there, it might make it simpler for maintaining the policy ourselves, and also not putting ourselves in a situation where we need to start crafting a policy for every single electoral-related responsibility that a candidate has.
Okay. Well, I would certainly be of the mindset to say that with these changes, that this may be a good start towards that, doing that. And potentially even adding additional information in the future could be helpful, and I think that's a positive thing. As the recommendations put forth by Ms. Voigt, I don't have any issue in how they're formed or the reorganization of a few paragraphs. I just don't want to be, to your point, Mr. Wad, to overdo it and then have to come back and change things that may change with state law.
I agree.
I think the spirit of this is try to help people find out what they're doing, and maybe if they decide to run and find some of these things, it's also confirmed for them in our policy, and maybe vice versa. It does clean things up for us a little bit, though, Dr. Siebert, to have some more specifics in these areas, as you had mentioned.
Talking to Mrs. Voigt's number 2 and 3 that she added.
Yes.
I don't think it hurts at all. I think it provides just that little bit of additional clarity, and I think her ordering system actually is helpful too. It makes it a little more clear what applies to declaration of candidacy versus non-candidacy. And in looking at the WEC website, I didn't do obviously a deep search, but I didn't see anything on non-candidacy. Just in a quick overview.
I think it's
So,
just a Neola thing.
yeah, so it's helpful to have it here.
Okay. So I would be looking for a motion to put forward the changes to the policy as amended.
I can make that motion since I've given the guideline to you.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mr. Watt. All those in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye. Passes 3-0. All right,
And if
let's,
we can actually get this like in the right order, with Julie, would that be something we can give them, you know? Like this, with this, like in the revised version, that they could actually, when they look at it, it's gonna make a lot more sense than this. All right, thank you.
all right, our next policy this evening would be 0143.1, which is public expression of board members.
All right, so this one is relatively straightforward. Very few changes. Just, I think, really trying to make clear what this board understands very, very well. is that when individuals are making statements, that those statements don't reflect the thoughts of the full board when you're making them as an individual board member. And I think the other piece that it's trying to make it clear is that, maybe that is exactly what I wanted to, I think that is essentially what I wanted to say. But any questions that you might have on the Neola suggested updates?
Any comments or questions on this policy?
Just
Go ahead, Mr. Watson.
Just a quick one. So when we talk about two members of the community, that leaves it pretty vague. So I started asking myself, okay, what situations might that cover? I'm out with some friends socializing and I make a comment about a policy, something that's coming before the board. Casual conversation is, I'm just wondering, is that something that's covered? Or what about on a personal Facebook page where I do not identify myself as a school board member? Now, personally, I do not comment on school board issues at all on my personal social media, but I could see someone in what they consider a private setting where they have only family and friends, a small group. Would that be considered if someone were to issue something without that clarifying statement? I'm speaking as a member of the board and not for the board. Is that going to be required in private communications with people in the community, whether that be through social media or in person? I'm not sure how to interpret this as it's currently written. And maybe I'm overanalyzing it. If I am, please feel free to let me know.
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, it does imply that, in any of those circumstances, that you should make it clear that the views are not necessarily the views of the board or your colleagues on the board. Now, can any of you be in that position 100% of the time, right? To, like, every time you say something, to be able to remember to say, this is my view and not theirs? Probably not, right? So I do think there's some challenge in that.
I just, to follow up on that, I'm concerned about the broad and vague nature of two members of the community. I don't know who, you could literally interpret that any number of ways, and I'm not sure the intention is to make board members feel like that in any casual conversation that they have, one-on-one conversation with someone they bump into in a grocery store, a friend, a neighbor, that they have to start every comment about their last board meeting with speaking as a individual board member and not on behalf of the board. This is what I believe, or this is what I witnessed. I can see it in more formal communications, or ones in which you actually are speaking as a board member, right, as opposed to, like I say, those more casual conversations. That's my only concern about this, is that it's vague, and I'm not sure that I completely understand what it is that this means when it says two members of the community. Anyone else struggling with that, or is it just me?
No, I think it's kind of vague for the very reason of why it's kind of confusing and not necessarily defined, because I'm not so sure that you can define every situation, even if you tried. Part of, I think the spirit of the policy does well enough to say, when speaking on matters in the board, I would think to people that you're not acquainted with or not friendly with, who may be taking your comments as, I'm speaking as a board member for the board, to make sure that they understand that you're not. Which I think, again, is discretion that everyone has to use when out in the public. It does say in the line underneath Part D there, so I guess it'd be the third paragraph, but it says sometimes public statements or statements to individuals by board members imply, or the readers or listeners infer, that the opinions expressed or statements made are the official positions of the board. So on the flip side of that, we're also saying, people can perceive anything they like, and sometimes if perhaps you don't clarify what you're speaking to or how you're speaking in your position, they could take it to mean that you are speaking for them. So I kind of like that there because it kind of also gives the other side of, maybe we shouldn't let people perceive that we're trying to say something or speak something that, maybe we're not doing. So, I mean, I like the few changes that were made. I don't have, maybe to your point of saying members of the community, even to rephrase that, I don't know that we're not speaking of the same group of people, right? I mean, however we would define that or define it further, we're still speaking of all of those that we're going to go out and talk to and converse with at times as members of a board and make sure that they understand what our official capacity is. I guess his personal responsibility is really part of this too. So, in other words, I'm not sure how to clean it up further.
And it's repeated, just the idea, or statements to individuals, that's the highlighted, put in there twice. To members of the community, it's in there twice. So I'm thinking this is something that Neola is all about, that piece of it, since it's like a reinforcement, the way it's written in this particular document.
Sure. Well, and Neola updates come in a variety of forms. Sometimes they're statutorily related or something that comes from a budget, that's included in a budget. Other times they're just from experiences in the field. And so Neola represents a lot of districts, and this might be something that they're trying to move forward to assist because they've seen some challenges with this in other parts of the country, perhaps. But to the extent that you wanted to remove, for example, members of the community because you find that it might be a little bit confusing, to Mrs. Voigt's point, you still have statements to individuals in the first sentence of that paragraph, which is essentially, to her point, I think she's right, it's very similar, right? So when you're talking to individuals, is that different than talking to members of the community? I mean, it potentially is the same thing if you want to just keep one and not the other. And there's no statutory reference to this, so, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have to take the changes at all if you don't like.
Mrs. Voigt.
So thanks for that clarification, because there isn't a statutory reference. So it fits in the category of just experiences and just trying to deal with things they've seen.
That would be my assumption, yes.
Mr. Watt?
I don't have a strong feeling on this one way or the other. I was a little concerned about the ambiguity. Perhaps you're right, Mr. Zenobia, that ambiguity may require board members to think more carefully before they speak, even in one-on-one conversations with people that they have that they don't represent. They don't make the mistake of appearing to represent the full view of the board. So I don't have a major objection to it. I just expressed some concern about the ambiguity.
Sure. No, absolutely. Yes, Mr. Watt.
I would move to adopt Public Expressions of Board Member Policy 143.1 revisions as presented.
I have a second for that.
Second it.
Thank you, Mrs. Voigt. All those in favor?
I,
Aye.
All those, I'm sorry, aye. All those opposed? Measure passes 3-0. So let's move on to our fourth action item, which is policy conflict of interest, 0144.3.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Zenobia. So this one, this is statutory at the end. It references that no board member shall hold a paid position within the school district, regardless of the type or level of the position or manner of pay. However, a board member may serve as a volunteer coach or supervisor of an extracurricular activity if the provision of 120.20 in Wisconsin state statutes and our volunteers policy, board policy is followed. So board members can coach, board members can on a volunteer basis. We talked about it earlier this evening. Board members can drive buses. There are
Just
different
that didn't
things.
hear. That's what I was just
There are
gonna
different
ask.
things that you can do on a volunteer basis if you'd like to. It's just that you can't be paid, and it's just clarifying that.
Mrs. Voigt.
My question, are there any other volunteer roles besides the bus driver that could be added? Or would we have to look into 12020 in the Wisconsin statutes, policy 8120, about volunteering? Because this is very specific to be a volunteer coach or like supervisor of an extracurricular activity, like a, advisor type of thing. But are there other things, like could you be a substitute, in the classroom or as a volunteer? Or could you be, what other things might you be able to, besides bus driver?
Sure.
Might you be able to volunteer and do?
Sure.
Go ahead, Mr. Watson.
yeah, so I actually have 120.20 with me, and it specifically states, school board member may serve as a volunteer coach or supervisor of extracurricular activity. And the only other thing that it calls out specifically is that a school board member may serve as a volunteer school bus driver. And then it provides the requirements of doing each. So it appears as though the statutes are specifically pinpointed at volunteer coaches or supervisors of extracurriculars and bus drivers.
Could we add bus driver then, to bring it up to the current statute?
Can't hurt.
The language that Mr. Wad mentioned from 120.20 is also in the volunteer policy, specifically. Board member may serve as a volunteer coach or supervisor of an extracurricular activity.
That's what they're saying specifically there.
So it's in the
Policy
volunteer,
8120.
it's in 8120 as well. So if you wanted to add bus driver, for example, we'd need to bring that one back forward ultimately and change it in there as well, which we could do in December.
So put a hold on this one and add bus driver for December?
Well, if
up to
it does guide us to that policy, I mean, from my view, it does provide the more specifics of where you can find exactly what's being said. And we certainly can bring it forward and then revise the other policy as well. I don't know how much clarity that gives to the policy, but we certainly can do that.
Or just accept it as it is and not make a big deal about the bus
Yeah, I mean,
driver?
all the information is there that we can go and find what specifically it's speaking to. So I'm, would be looking for a motion to amend or to adopt as it's presented. I know we had, when I first came on, we talked about this policy at length before this was added and had a lot of discussion on what those conflict of interests could or couldn't entail. And, all of this is in statute of what must be there. So to add this for that same reason, I think it is done here in the policy and, looks to me to be pretty good, so. Mr. Watt.
Yeah, I would move to adopt revisions to policy 144.3, conflict of interest as presented.
Do you have a second?
Sure.
Second by Mrs. Voigt. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? So measure passes 3-0. So then our next policy item would be, our next action item is number 5, which would be a number of policies 0164, 164.1.2, 0165.1, and 0165.2, all having to do with our meeting policies.
All right, so, thank you. This one, when I mentioned there were 49 policies in the update, this is 5 in one motion, so
Yeah.
this is a good thing. This is taking the current policies we have one on regular meetings, one on special meetings, one on notice of meetings, one on change of regular meetings, and putting them all in one policy, which would be the new policy 0164 meetings. So it puts everything in one place instead of having 4 different policies in regards to the different types of meetings.
Mrs. Voigt.
I don't think this needs a lot of discussion. I think it's just a clean way of make this policy and delete the ones that that it's replacing, basically. My only question is that in the second paragraph under change of regular meetings, it talks about said notice shall be posted on the front door of the administrative office building and at such places as the board may determine. You know, meeting notices of scheduled board meetings shall be posted in accordance with state law. Do we have such a bulletin board on our front door here at Blair? We do?
Yes,
Okay.
we do.
All right. I'm not aware of it, but that's good. So if that is the case, then I move that we that we approve the new policy 0164 on meetings and then delete the 4 related policies that it replaces. And those we can spell out, 0164.1, regular meetings, 0164.2, special meetings, 0165.1, notice of meetings, and 0165.2, change of regular meetings.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. All those in favor of the policy amended as presented? Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? So the measure passes 3-0. All right, our 6th action item then is the policy 1260, incapacity of the superintendent.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Zenobia. So this one is pretty straightforward. It just adds a section in the first paragraph that allows the board president to have the authority to take or delegate necessary administrative actions on behalf of the district should the superintendent become incapacitated. And then it refers to the interim superintendent, which would be the person that the board president selects going forward.
Okay. Mr. Watt?
So Dr. Siebert, I'm looking at this in the first paragraph, the board president having the authority to take or delegate necessary administrative actions until the interim is appointed. Is that what we would do today, and it's just not specified in the policy? Or what would happen if we didn't adopt this? Who would act as the interim before the interim? Who would that be?
Well, the way it's written today, it just doesn't have that sentence that's added about the board president. So you probably would go into a closed session and
Emergency
determine what
Emergency
you wanted
board
to do.
meeting to make-
Okay.
Yes. Where here, this would give, in this case, Dr. Piasek the ability to take on the necessary administrative actions, do it herself for a period of time until you could have that meeting, or most likely she would want to confer with you as well in terms of what the next steps would be.
I would move to adopt revisions to policy 1260, incapacity of the superintendent as presented.
I second it.
Thank you, Mrs. White. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That measure will pass 3-0. Our final action item this evening is policy 8146, notification of educational options.
All right. So with this one, it's just providing a little bit of additional clarity, essentially kind of matching what we do and putting it into policy, which we sometimes see as another Neola action. So by January 31st, providing the Class 1 notice on the district's website in regards to the educational options. These always get approved at Teaching and Learning and then by the full board. Talking about the pieces that, what the options all need to include, which we already do. And then the second paragraph just specifying in that notice, which is on the website, identifying the most recent report card accountability rating assigned to each school, which we've done under the educational accountability or educational options section of the website. And then telling parents where they can get the availability of the full school and district accountability reports, which we have a link to that as well. So we're already in compliance with this. It's more, I think, just putting a little more clarity in the policy of what people can expect.
Mrs. Voigt.
I move that we approve policy 8146, notification of educational options as presented.
Second?
Thank you, Mr. Wad. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? So it passes 3-0. And that will move us on to our government relations discussion for the evening.
Yes.
The first of which would be our legislative updates.
Right. Well, so we have in the past had state budget and legislative update. Now that we're done with the state budget, essentially, we thought we'll just move on and just do legislative update. And so a couple of these are Mrs. Voigt's from a couple of months ago. One was Speak Up, Speak Out. That had not been funded through the state budget, if everybody remembers. But the Office of School Safety secured one-time funding to keep it alive through the end of 2024. So I can tell you it is working. Students are using it. We're getting the alerts, and we're following up on those and through the principals and assistant principals and working through those pieces. So it is a valuable tool that alerts us to some things that we might otherwise not know, which is helpful. The second one from Mrs. Voigt from our last meeting is just trying to do a little bit of a follow-up on childcare in Wisconsin. This is a little dated already. The governor had tried to call a special session on it. I believe it was a gavel in, gavel out type of scenario, and I don't know that there's certainly anything to report on it at this point. I think it's kind of just sitting there, but per Mrs. Voigt's request, I just wanted to bring forward what I could find on it, and then see if there was any questions anybody had on that topic.
Any questions or comments on either of those?
Okay, all right, let's go to the next one, which is SB 395. SB stands for Senate Bill versus AB, which is Assembly Bill in the state legislature. Remove the revenue limit restrictions for failed operating referendums. So this is looking to repeal. There is a current law on the books that says if you fail a operating referendum, so there's two types of referendums. The operating ones are the ones where you are trying to ask for funding to just operate the district. So on a recurring or non-recurring basis. So we want $4 million a year, we'd like $8 million a year, something like that, not a building project type of referendum. If you fail one of those referendums, for 3 years following that, you can't go up to the revenue limit that is allowable. So for example, in this budget where we have the ability as a low-spending school district to go up to $11,000 per pupil in spending, had we failed a operating referendum within the last 3 years, we wouldn't be able to do that. So this bill is asking for that to be removed so that those districts that did fail those types of referendums could still have the revenue limit authority opportunity. So it's an interesting one. We'll see ultimately where it goes. There's, I want to say, somewhere between 15 and 20 school districts in Wisconsin, if I recall correctly, in that boat that have had those failed referendums, which are tough, right? Because you're not asking if you don't need the money, and then ultimately they don't pass, and then you can't take advantage of the other state opportunities. So it's a challenging environment for those districts. The next one is SB 83. This one's been banted around before, and what it would make possible or require is that when you are writing a referendum question, you can have 2 referendum questions per referendum cycle. And currently, you just have to say what you're going for with enough specificity that a person can understand it. We're asking for whatever $1 million for building improvements, and then you kind of outline those building improvements. This would say, along with asking that question, you would have to communicate the interest rate and the estimated amount of interest that would accrue on the money that you're asking to borrow, to help taxpayers have a more clear picture of what the total spending would be like. So this has been around before. It hasn't passed, but we'll see where it goes this time. It's an interesting one.
It would be nice if they could write all of those statements that they ask with more clarity,
Yes,
not just referendum ones, but all
Sure,
of them are
sure.
always tricky.
yes, exactly. All right. The next one I had for you was SB 429 on school start date. This one, I don't believe is getting a lot of positive traction. Most school start date bills don't, due to the tourism industry. Understandably, the tourism industry gets concerned if part of summer gets taken away. But what this bill would allow, right now, we can't start until September 1st or later in public schools. This would allow that you could start the Monday before Labor Day as long as you took the Friday before Labor Day off. So essentially, you could get 4 days of school in most years in the last week of August, which would then allow you to have, get done 4 days earlier on the back end, which would most likely for us would always be in the first week of June as opposed to the second week of June. So there'd be some excitement about that. And then if you didn't, for example, have a spring break, you could get done potentially as early as Memorial Day. But
Go ahead, Mr. Watt.
Dr. Stephen, I'm reading this a little bit differently. I'm reading this to say that under this bill, classes would not be able to start until after Labor Day, as opposed to starting on September 1st. So I'm looking at the second paragraph under analysis by the Legislative Reference Bureau. Under this bill, beginning in the 2024-25 school year, public schools are prohibited from starting fall classes until the Monday before Labor Day. Additionally, under the bill, if the public school starts fall classes before Labor Day, the public school must be closed on the Friday before Labor Day. That's contradictory, isn't it?
Well, I know what you're saying. So I think what that's trying to address is right now districts can get waivers. They're primarily for building projects. So let's pretend you pass a referendum in 1 year, but with supply chain issues and so forth, you can't get the project started until the following summer. If you wanted, you can apply for a waiver to the DPI that says we want to start late to let those projects go a little bit longer, but we also want to get done early, or vice versa. We want to like districts, some districts get waivers to be able to start at different times primarily because of building projects, or end at different times. So I think this would remove some of that and say, you can't go any earlier than the Monday before. That you'd be prohibited from going any earlier than that. And maybe that was like the trade-off potentially with the, to try to get the tourism industry to like it, if that makes any sense.
One thing that jumped out at me is in the second part where it talks about, under the bill, that any school would have to be closed on the Friday then before Labor Day. And my thought there was, you have people going on vacations and things, and what kind of issues does it cause for any school just to have a lot of kids that aren't there because they're going on a Friday for the long weekend and knowing that they got Monday off. I mean, I can kind of understand it from that standpoint as well. You speak of the tourism industry, but it's just a weekend that a lot of people take advantage of and travel. So I would think there'd be a lot of bodies that aren't in school anyway on that, especially on that Friday.
Sure.
I didn't mean to jump in front of you, Mr. Watt, if you had more clarification there, but is there from I know a lot of other schools do start earlier than the Labor Day weekend. Is there any advantages from an educational standpoint, or is it just a matter of getting out at more days in June, you take them in late August as opposed to June?
Yeah, I think that's probably a matter of opinion. I don't know if there'd be any true research on it. I mean, it's warm in both instances, generally. No matter when you get done, Mrs. Voigt, as a former teacher, you'd know this, right? No matter when you get done, the last days of school are not as productive, whether they're in June or May, probably, right? So I don't know that there's any educational true benefit to it. I think the schools that can start earlier do, just because maybe sells a little better to get done around Memorial Day, and you get a little bit more summer. So maybe a better example, Mr. Wad, to try to answer your question, is sometimes schools will ask to start earlier in August so they can get done in May, so that those building projects can get an extra couple of weeks in the summertime that they otherwise wouldn't get.
Yeah. I do think, Dr. Siebert, and perhaps you and I can talk about this offline more, as I read this, this is actually changing when a school district may start from September 1st until after Labor Day. And that if you wanted to start earlier, you would need to file for a request to start prior to Labor Day. So this would actually move the start date out from September 1st to after Labor Day.
Well, we should talk, 'cause
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm seeing that, but I value what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm looking at I'm actually looking at the statute language to it. It's clear to me that that's what they're attempting to do here.
Okay.
And as someone who grew up in a family that was heavily engaged in the tourism industry, I know why they want that. It is devastating to tourist businesses to lose all of their help prior to Labor Day, which may not speak to its educational merits, but I just looking at who's authoring this, I'm certain that that's what this bill is attempting to do, is to protect employers over Labor Day weekend.
All right. Well, thank you for that. All right. Well, let's move on. We'll go to AB 370. This one is around guaranteed UW system admissions for certain pupils. So what this one would do is it would require the Board of Regents of the UW system and technical college district boards to guarantee admission for applicants ranked in the top 5% of their high school class. So they would have to accept those students into their schools. And it would apply to the top 5% of public, private, and tribal high schools in Wisconsin. It would apply to homeschool students that have been or expected to get a high school diploma, and those that achieve, they'd have to achieve an ACT exam score in the top 5% of their scores. So I think to me, it looks to be one of those types of bills that tries to keep kids here at home in Wisconsin and hopefully help them maintain here after graduation. So see where that one goes. It's interesting. The next one is SB 335. That one looks at allowing the hiring of non-licensed district administrators or superintendents. There currently is that ability in the first-class city school district, the only one we have in Wisconsin, which is Milwaukee. So MPS has that ability. But this would create that ability for all other school districts to employ a school district administrator not licensed formally by the DPI. So it's an interesting one. Being a superintendent myself, I don't necessarily struggle with it. I think, we've had to do things creatively with teachers, right, to try to find different pathways for people. And I think specifically about some small districts that maybe really struggle to find a candidate. So I'm always open to those kind of things, seeing what's possible.
Mr. Watt?
Yeah, that's actually a question I have for you, Dr. Seaver. Perhaps you can help me understand something. So it would seem to me that the biggest beneficiaries of this legislation, if it were to pass, would be small rural school districts. I find it interesting that the only school district in the state that's allowed currently to hire someone who isn't licensed is the largest. Do we know why that is? Do you know why Milwaukee has that exception?
No, I don't.
Okay.
It is interesting, though. I would agree with you. Just a couple more to tick off for you. I wanted to just outline in the summers after the budget is passed, there are usually task forces or legislative study committee type opportunities. And in this particular summer, or actually into the fall here, I should say, they hope to have these wrapped up by December. There are 4 task forces that Speaker Voss has put together. Interesting topics, I thought, that are quite timely. One on artificial intelligence, one on childhood obesity, one on truancy, and one on human trafficking, which we've talked about here in student services a little bit. So what happens with these is they are led by freshmen, I think, and/or sophomore legislators to give them leadership opportunities. And they put together a team of people, and they try to come up with some ideas on how to address or how to attack or how to handle some of these situations, which are all certainly real situations for the state of Wisconsin. So we'll see where those go over time. And then the last thing I had for you today was just, we've talked quite a bit about Act 20, which ultimately is the reading bill in the state of Wisconsin, moving toward the science of reading. Part of that was creating an early literacy curriculum council with 9 members, 3 selected by the DPI, and then 3 selected by 3 selected by the speaker, and 3 selected by of the state assembly, and 3 by the majority leader of the Wisconsin State Senate. So I just gave you a listing of those. In our area, Joe Garza, the superintendent from New Berlin, they've been on the forefront of the science of reading for some time now and are seeing really some great results. So certainly good to see him have that opportunity. There's a second grade teacher from Greenfield, which is relatively close to us, so we'll see where that all goes, but quite interesting. And I think for now, that's all I have, but we'll continue to, as we get this group more established, there's some, we talked earlier tonight about some WASB pieces we could do here. There's various different pieces we can bring in here to talk about and move forward on, so appreciate it.
Thank you for that. It's a lot of information that we covered there. Just going back to the task forces, have you noticed in the past of any of those that have made their way into bills, any of significance that, ring a bell over the years that kind of led to something?
It's a good question. Off the top of my head, I'm not coming up with a good example, but you would tend to think, sure. I mean, you would tend to think, yes, there must be some pieces that come in. We'll watch these to see
All serious
what ultimately
issues,
comes in.
sure.
Yes.
All right, our last item would be other business. Are there any recommendations for future meetings? Mrs. Voigt?
I would think that with the timing in December of our next meeting, right, 2 months out,
Yep.
that the WASB proposals that would be up for discussion at the January meeting might be an appropriate topic for us to look at and and I'm not sure who our representative is. Do you know who is selected to do that?
That'd be me.
You are the
Zenobia.
WASB rep, okay. So if you'd want to have that on the agenda to get feedback about what those topics are?
Does a resolution packet come out?
I think we usually
Thank
get,
you.
I think we usually have it by now, but I don't think we do
Yeah.
yet. We should have it any
It was
day.
well before December that we had it last,
Yes, yes. We
That's what I'm
should,
thinking it's safe for a December topic.
right? I wasn't,
yeah, we should definitely be safe by then, and we can kind of walk through them one by one, get the committee's view on giving.
Do all school board members get a copy of that, or is it something that would come to you,
Yeah.
Mr. Zenobia, that you would have to share out?
everyone had gotten a copy. I don't recall as much, I was in the WASB rep last year, but was the prior year, and we definitely got it all. I think it was September, or maybe.
I thought it was September too. I'm not sure, Mr.
like
Watt,
10
if everybody gets them, but we will make copies so that everybody will have them.
Thank you.
And then usually there's usually double digits, somewhere around 10 to, there can be as many as 15, 18. But they're kind of fun to walk through. And in the old government, when we used to just have government relations as a committee, Mrs. Voigt was on that, we would do that exercise and kind of walk through those as a group together. And then ultimately, we can walk through them at the full board as well, probably not as in-depth. It'll take us a little time in here to be able to go through it, but this is a good time. That'll be a great topic for us to tackle.
Thank you. Any other recommendations? Then that will adjourn our meeting for this evening. Thank you all for taking the time.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
I was going to say.